Okay. Welcome back for those of you who have stuck it out for 3 days. And we know it's a long symposium and there is a lot of topics to be explored. But we are on our final session and we're calling it Terms of Art, Reflection, Dialogue, and Facilitating Change. And we're sort of seeing this as a sort of similar to our continuing conversations for open office hours. We want to see this as more of an informal conversation, both between maybe the 4 of us co-hosts, but then also you, because what we want to sort of do is think about and talk about and reflect about the common threads that have sort of woven through the past 3 days. What themes have emerged, what sort of has come up that's interesting to us, and see also what's actionable, honestly, because part of this is seeking out and learning from and working with other institutions who are either sort of facing the same challenges that we're facing, or maybe have solutions that we haven't thought about, and we've talked about this again in a few sessions, but thinking about sort of shared partnerships. If we have a subject matter expert in one area, but you have a subject matter expert in another, we can, as partners, close those gaps for each other, and just keep connected and keep an open dialogue. So with that sentiment, I just wanted to quickly reintroduce my co-conspirators for this entire thing before sort of launching into the questions that we started to ask ourselves. And we're sort of going to do it in no particular order. We're just going to, think about some of the ones that maybe either feel a little bit spicy and should be addressed, or just the ones that felt interesting to us. So once again, I am Meredith. I am the Assistant Director of Digital Platforms, Media, and Archives at the Hood. And Beth, Ashley, and John, could you quickly introduce yourself before I go to the first question?
You said my name first. So I'm Beth Mattison, and I'm the Andrew W. Mellon Associate Curator of Academic Programming at the Hood.
Yes, and I'm Ashley Offill. I am the Associate Curator of Collections, also at the Hood.
Hello again, everybody. I'm John Bell. I'm the Director of the Data Experiences and Visualization Studio at Dartmouth.
Right, so as you can see, sort of a variety of disciplines, but definitely we've all sort of co-conspired both in this and then outside of this work as well, hence why we are all here today. Wow. So the first question that I sort of wanted to see both to my co-conspirators, but to anybody who feels comfortable chiming in, is sort of thinking about how we can incorporate and allow for a multiplicity of voices. So, thinking back especially to that first day of outdated or harmful terminology, and the fact that there's, even disagreement within the community about what counts as that. And then in addition to, it also came up again today in Ashley's conversation about student work. And in Jessica and Amelia's presentations, Jessica, Amelia, and Melanie, sorry, Melanie. Jessica, Amelia, and Melanie's presentations about crowdsourcing data. So again, we're sort of seeing these solutions and ideas that come up with an account for making sure that there's multiple ways of knowing in these systems. So I wanted to hear what my co-conspirators think about that. And again, folks chime in.
I guess something that comes up with me in relation to that is the challenge of the systems that we're working with, how much they do or do not allow for that multiplicity. I think when we go back to things like cataloging, there's often this idea that there needs to be a singular authorial voice of the museum. And so while we can do audit trails and that sort of thing to track who puts what sort of information in, often it's not set up to identify specific voices or even allow for the layering of different voices. And so in a situation where we're trying to encourage that in different parts of our practice, where might we also need to look at the tools we're using that probably aren't set up to allow for that? So just again, thinking about TMS, because that's what I'm familiar with. Yeah, I guess that was musing on that led to nowhere, but that's where I started off.
I mean, I think there's also a question of trying to capture more information about the voices in the first place. So it's one thing to have a system that allows you to record multiple perspectives or multiple descriptions of a particular object. But then you also need to have information about who is creating those descriptions in order to really understand how they interact or fit in with the descriptions created by other people who may have a more or less authoritative voice or may have more expert background in the area. But even beyond that, I think that there's a larger question around the sort of the ways that we choose to display what we do and don't know, and the things that we're only sort of guessing at. So to give a concrete example, there's one project I've been working on for a little while that is a reconstruction of a basilica in Rome that burned down and was reconstructed several times. The historical reconstruction of it, there are aspects of it that we know because, for instance, we have documentation of it. So we might know that there's a particular column in a particular location, but we may not know exactly what it's made out of. And yet we still have to portray it somehow as being made out of something. So in that particular system, because it's an immersive sort of presentation, we can do things like change the texture of the reconstruction in order to say, you know, we have a pretty good idea of this, but we don't absolutely know. So what you're looking at is not ground truth. I think that a lot of the metadata systems that we work with in general don't have that sort of epistemic filter built into them at all. So we can't even capture that information, much less present it back to users and really give them a way of trying to understand how they should be framing what it is that they're seeing. It strikes me that that kind of capture is a fundamental part of what we're going to have to add to systems in order to get to where we're trying to go with some of these discussions.
So I think you raise a lot of really good points there, John, and also are kind of pointing us to the tension at the heart of our work that's also just built into how museums, how libraries, how academia is structured, that requires a surety and evidence and privileges sort of an authoritative academic voice, and doesn't necessarily allow for those kinds of questions to arise or tries to submerge the questions, perhaps, in certain cases. And that can kind of be counter to the polyvocality, the multivocality that we might seek, and also tends to, say, privilege certain kinds of knowledge holders over others.
And I think we see that a lot with, you know, museums who are based in the US, who sort of consider themselves to be encyclopedic, who collected largely by looting from other cultures, and then whose heritage that they own was described not by members of the community, right? And then you sort of see the lens. And so like also just thinking back to like what John said, like about whose lens was this language assigned? And then, you know, what does that mean and how can we problematize it? And then, you know, I'm also thinking about Ashley's example of Caitlin's work, where Caitlin was like, you know, this means something different here, you know, because, you know, for languages where there's either not a linguistic equivalent or there are many linguistic equivalents depending on the context, you know, if you are not either like deeply enmeshed within the culture or part of the culture itself, it's not going to make a whole lot of sense. You're going to say like a shirt is a shirt is a shirt. And you're like, no, this shirt is actually like, has this meaning, this shirt is that meaning. And a specific example is actually like, I think, well, I'm not going to because I'm not a scholar. My degrees are in my library science. So like, maybe I'm not going to go there. But
I can give you a specific example.
Yay, save me.
And then I'll turn it back to you.
Oh, no.
So Ashley and I are currently involved in a project cataloging the Hood's early modern sculpture. And Ashley is sort of trained as an Italianist, and I am trained as a Northern Europeanist. And even the word emblem has very different meanings for Ashley as it does for me in our own scholarly. And that's within the same century and the same continent that we're looking at. And it's not applicable to both of those cases. And she keeps deleting what I put in, which is true because I'm factually incorrect.
That's amazing.
Well, and that brings up something I was thinking of when you were talking, Meredith, also, is that so much thought often goes into whatever word we use or decision we make as we are, striving toward better clarity and accuracy. So thinking back on the idea of language and translation, right? Something that we've recently decided to do at the Hood is be consistent, surprising, in translated titles. So having the source language first and then the English translation after, which to us makes sense. We understand why we're doing it and why we're positioning it that way. But in that it's not common across the field to do it that way, is this a moment where we made a decision? We also need to explain why we made that decision in some way, so that people can see, oh, this is purposeful, like they're trying to correct something, which is, the assumption that English is always the primary language. So that came to mind for some reason while you were talking, Meredith.
Yeah, definitely. It's again also thinking about like who's going to access it in the end as well, like who's going to see it, who's going to experience it, and how are they going to experience, and like, in what context as well. And sort of again also like the impact that it may or may not have, but then also for the end user, like what do they think is appropriate or not, because that's the other thing, is like as sites of education, people learn stuff. It's a very technical term, stuff, but they learn when they come within our walls, no matter where we work, right? Is so what we ultimately present to them is, as being seen as the authoritative voice, is like what they think our position is. And so that's, I'm sort of going back to day one on Alex's presentation actually about describing bodily differences and sort of like demedicalizing a lot of it, is a very clear sort of stance that like thinking differently about that. So you're not, going in thinking that language is appropriate to talk about another human being. And so that's also sort of that, I think, thread as well, is like the lack of neutrality that we have inherently.
And I think you're also raising there a theme that has come out through a number of these presentations of our inherited vocabularies and the historical context of a lot of these words that are often at odds with our aims to be more inclusive and just generally less racist or misogynist or any manner of other things.
Yeah, it's a lot of the stuff that I'm listening to and learning. Oh gosh, I hate that, listening and learning. That was like the terrible phrase that everybody went through in 2020. But what's sort of being absorbed here is for those of us who I can't tell you what our history classes are like now, but a lot of the language that I was taught in undergrad is the language that we are trying to eradicate now, or that we are trying to sort of say, like, this belongs in this context, but not that context, as opposed to sort of like the word. And because again, it's one lens, one voice, and not sort of the multiplicity, the multiple ways of knowing. And also again, like treating cultures as monoliths in and of themselves. So especially in colonized continents, colonized countries, where people start to sort of naturally lump protocols in, when actually these are like different, distinct groups of people whose customs and heritage are informed so largely by place. Should we move on to another question, since I seem to have killed this thread?
Well, the thing that I'll sort of pick up on from that is that I do hear a lot of very good intentions from the institutions that we're talking about. And the question often comes down to resources and, oh, but it's much harder to do things in this sort of multifaceted way because you have to actively go out and get more people. And you can't just sit down and go through a large collection, right? So there's a sort of tension between scaling and resources and the responsible presentation of this information. And I'm just curious from the three of you, since I don't actually work in a museum, how much does an institution feel like it's willing to go outside of the select people that they've been able to actually hire and crowdsource and get different perspectives and all of those sort of things? Is it a resource problem? Is it a sort of is there a feeling of responsibility towards the works that it's difficult to sort of give up that level of control to folks? I'm just sort of curious what the thinking is.
I mean, you are plucking at a really sensitive thread here, John, that goes far beyond, I think, the scope of this conference. I will say that some of it is a resourcing problem, yes, where we're not necessarily devoting resources to the invisible labor that often happens in these sorts of conversations and actions, because ultimately nobody ever sees who puts the data in or understands how long it takes or understands all the decisions that go into it. They see the art on the walls, or they see, the blockbuster project that you're putting out, which, ultimately gets you more funding, but it gets funding for the people putting out the blockbuster project, not for like the Bets and Ashleys of the world who are just like, put your stuff in the database, please. This is, to borrow, I don't know if she's in attendance, but if she's I'm crediting you, to borrow something that a colleague, Amanda Deerolf, has said, as long as I've known her, is that this is a form of communication, not work. It is work to communicate, but that's what you use the database for, is to communicate information. And so, yes, there is that. But John, you are also plucking at issues of museum governance and sort of requirement to uphold the status quo based on who is giving us money. So if depending on who sort of maintains power in a museum, quite frankly, is also going to determine whose voices are at the table and how. So you're talking then again about board values and the values of your director and senior staff. And that is about as far as I can go on a publicly recorded Zoom call.
Go ahead, Ashley.
Nope, go Beth.
I would just add that maybe we're not even the best people to answer that question, because in many ways we are in a very privileged position as a university art museum in a very well-funded university. So that obviates a lot of the typical issues of boards that other institutions I know and our colleagues face. And that we also have a small-ish staff, it's rapidly growing, that we're situated within that larger research university that we can call on any number of colleagues across the greater university to help and drag into projects like you, John. which I know is not the case for so many other people, for so many other institutions, for so many other colleagues.
Yeah, and I was just going to make the point that in some ways this is such a sea change. It's going against so much tradition that even where there is a desire, sometimes because there is no roadmap, there isn't a clear, like, this is who we go to, or this is how we even manage, bringing in other voices. That something I've seen at pretty much every institution I've been at is that it's so easy to get overwhelmed and spend so much time talking about how to do it that whatever it is never happens. Which again is part of why, we organize a symposium, is because it's so easy to do the talking, but then how do you get on to the doing? And a lot of times when you're in a very specific location, like you are part of that institution, your resources, you might be limited by what you see. And so we need these connections, this kind of outreach, or not working elsewhere, or we tried this, so you guys don't have to try it and, fail the same way, but let's try this other solution instead. So I think in some ways the history and the kind of status quo-ness of the museum field makes it challenging. And that's why this kind of community building and collaboration is really essential to any kind of changes, whether that's in multivalency, cataloging, et cetera, on and on.
Yeah, and I, to sort of add to that, I see what Melanie has put in the chat, which is that it requires advocacy on part of the staff to explain why collaboration is necessary for something like cataloging, and then collaboration is more time and resources. Yeah, no, that's sort of the thing, is like, do you have the latitude to sort of manage up and advocate? And then, what we found, what's been, and again, like also echoing what Becca said, like we are in the privilege of not only just being part of a well-funded institution that we have access to, some of the top brains in the world and the top curators, two of who are here with me, is that we have top-down buy-in, which is a luxury for us, as well as like we have a director who really sees and values that work. And so that's sort of an additional privilege. And I don't just say that because he signs my paycheck. He doesn't actually, it's the trustees of Dartmouth. But the what I wanted to sort of like highlight is something that is a success story for us, is that, it was brought up a little bit in the first session about the reparative metadata, the reparative description team that I think Ashley are a part of. And that also, we've kind of extended that partnership, and now we have also sort of like the digital heritage part of it. So it's advocacy and resource sharing, so it's again, like finding people in the institution are saying like, we know what you're going through. And in our case, the library is actually advocating for us and throwing a lot of labor our way. And we hope to be able to reciprocate that in whatever capacity we can, but we found a partner, and it's been a success story. And I know that's not the case for everybody, but I just wanted to like talk about something that was cool,
Sorry, Meredith, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to make sure that we gave this topic breathing room before we maybe move on to our many other topics, because this one has taken us an hour to dissect.
I can let you move on. I was just going to point to Melanie's comment raises the point that cataloging is like deeply unsexy because it doesn't have it's not like a shiny exhibition you can put in a newspaper. Cataloging, if it ever is a newspaper headline, I will eat my hat, but is really sort of the necessary work. So it is really challenging to pitch it as something that requires so much investment of time, labor, and money.
So I want to pluck out another one that came up in almost every session on Monday, which I thought was a really interesting sort of theme, which is historic accountability and contextualization in conflict with end user safety? And we sort of touched on this earlier. Is removing problematic terms tantamount to erasure, or is it an act of reconciliation? What happens when members of the community don't agree?
I mean, oh, Strong, do you want to start us? No? Okay. The thing I was going to say was that, and this is something that I've been thinking about. I've been reading a lot of Aaron Thompson's work that looks at histories of monuments, and it brings into focus how general sometimes our understanding and knowledge of history is. You know, we think, oh, this is old, this happened in the past, so it must be from the original point. But when we get into like language, especially, that's not the case. You know, we have terms that we use in relation to, you know, the Italian Renaissance that come from Vasari, or that are, you know, Winkelmann. You know, there's always a trajectory. And I don't think that people are always good at looking back at that trajectory and identifying where things actually come into use and why. And I mean, so this comes up in Aaron Thompson's work in relation to Confederate monuments, which don't actually happen, you know, around the Civil War. They happen, you know, centuries, decades later. So when we're thinking about historic accountability, I think we need to know what history and whose history we are crediting that with, because that might bring some things into light. Because, like, yeah, are we supporting you know, the original context, or the context of someone who is using that history for their own purposes years later? So again, it's time, it's research, it's knowledge, it's challenging things, but I think a key thing is doing away with those initial assumptions about how and why a term came to be before we just say, oh, it's historical and that's why it is what it is. I don't know. I feel like I just went on a soapbox there. So feel free to counter or anything what I just said.
I mean, I don't think it's countering, but I think that the challenge comes in trying to map the data that we store to the audiences we expect to see it, and what those audiences will actually want to get out of it. Right now, I think that a lot of the metadata systems that we're working on, and for the exact reasons that you were all just talking about, right? They're sort of back office things. They're not necessarily the sexy thing. They are getting more directly exposed to end users because we have things like websites where you can go and search through collections. That didn't used to be a thing. So I think that we're just trying to now better understand how we can take the very datafied version of a collection and make it public without the sort of conceit that it's going to be neutral and objective, and it's just there to sort of back the people who are, or the curators who are taking the work out and creating the exhibition for it. It in itself needs to be an exhibition to a certain degree. So trying to modernize the language around it, sure, depending on the audience that you're expecting to go look at that. In some contexts, it's going to be valuable to front load the idea that we're trying to reduce harm. In other cases, it's going to be more valuable to an audience to look at the original terminology and historicize the terms that are being used. It's really just a question of not necessarily thinking that there is one output system for the work that you're trying to create.
John, I think you raised the really, really key notion there too, that the website has long, or websites have long been conceived of as in addition to the museum, and as opposed to an extension or part of the museum, and that this is how most people, or any really institution, any gallery, library, museum, that the website is the main way that people are going to first engage with an institution, and we have to treat it as such.
I'm really curious on this, if there are others who are listening beyond the four of us, if you have thoughts on this subject too.
It does seem like the chat is working, so if you don't want to unmute, you can put contributions in there and we will read them out.
Yeah. I'm happy to talk a little bit about my own woes with sort of standard museum websites. Again, I've probably bent John's ear about this more times than he can. I appreciate his patience. But when you have a collection that is so broad, the sort of nature, like homogenizing the nature of display within your website is also, I think, to sort of extend on that is another sort of issue. So like both in what Beth and John are saying about like the website is part of you. It's not just like this little node in your experience. It is and should be considered holistic to the museum experience. And just like we wouldn't necessarily put a label on the wall that we're not going to put the same label for a like Roman coin that we will for a contemporary painting. Or even in going back to Dr. Gallipoli's presentation on day 2, what information is important to convey about something to sort of indicate what it is and what's appropriate to put up. And so, what she was really grappling with is like, what is a cast? What is a cast of a cast? And how do we indicate that? So like similarly thinking about sort of the appropriateness of language in relation to the heritage it's trying to describe, and knowing that, a lot of the times for institutions that have been older, it's apples and oranges when it comes to a lot of our collection, and the website somehow still imposes like everything is a pear, and it's not true. Sorry for the analogy.
Well, and it's like this goes back to Beth's office hours too. The point that, when you're looking at photographs that were made in a country that no longer exists in that form, which moment do you record, or can you record both, and how do you do that? So I see we have someone in the comment. So Sherman says, it seems to me this is related to the binary question too. Cataloging may or may not be sexy and headline worthy, but at least library cataloging, has been binary, or rather authority. There is an answer to how to say a subject. That answer may change, but we don't generally do both and cataloging, we do either or.
I feel like I'm going to say something that might be slightly controversial to my TMS users out here. I sort of like the way that TMS does geography, because it's not prescriptive. And I think it's one of the only places I've ever seen that potentially allows for the more nuanced, like if you're a TMS person and you're like, Meredith, you are so wrong that you are like bathing in wrongness, please speak in. I just, in sort of configuring and introducing the use of TMS, we have so many options to sort of think about the gray areas of place that it sometimes feels a little bit less authoritative, especially because you can record so much in that area. And then you can also further contextualize it about what that area means to the artwork. So we will say in our database, this was like, where was this looted from? We actually have an option to record site looted or place looted. And then for photography, we record both, we can record, if we don't know where it was printed, we can record where it was imaged. And we can, and you know, there is still that issue of like historic geography versus current geography. And is it more relevant to record when it was or how it is? And but the thing is, TMS can do both. And I think that is one of the few times I've ever sort of seen that done successfully.
Meredith, I would like to give you a lot of credit though for teaching everybody else how to make TMS additive rather than binary, because at no institution that I've worked at has TMS been used in quite the way that you have taught us to use it.
Thank you. We have something from Lenore. How are paintings connected with slavery, such as Audubon's, addressed? Is note made on actual display or only through the internet? I would leave it to the curators. And also, I know that we have Audubon in the library as well. So if there's library folks from Ronner or archives, our library from Ronner or the archive, I'd love to. Yes, I recognize that not every museum uses TMS. I can only speak for the ones that do. I have used other databases, but yeah, it's true.
Yeah, and we do use specifically TMS, so it's the way that I think we've structured our mind of cataloging. I guess I would start with the Audubon question and the caveat that neither Ashley nor I are the curator of American art, and thus this falls outside of our purview. Currently, we have no descriptive terminology on or narrative descriptions on our website in addition to our objects. I believe we have a meeting about that sometime next week. So check back in a bit. But I think through our subject tagging is where we can add that sort of commentary as a kind of placeholder for the moment. And we're pretty robust about our subject tagging. Again, thanks in part to Meredith for teaching everyone how to use that. And making sure every object has not just things of like, it is round, this is about a bird, but also the sort of thematic elements that could be taught or explored in an object, like enslavement.
This again sort of strikes me as another area, and I'm sure this is partially because these are the things I'm interested in, but it strikes me as a area where a more network view of the data would be useful. So in terms of trying to say, okay, this is a work who is connected with a creator who is potentially problematic, rather than tagging every single instance of work by that creator, you just have another linked record where you're describing their creator and you're then saying, you know, you're exploring their history there. Being able to change the sort of primary record from a very object-based record to a more sort of democratic network of records seems like a one way to start to approach that problem.
I see we have something from Carrie, and actually, I don't want to put you too on the spot, Carrie, but so you can respond in the chat if you want. But Carrie's question is we transcribe our most recent wall labels into our database, which rolls over to our public collections website. So if we tackle sensitive topics in the label, they would show there. That's awesome. My question to you is because it's something we want to do, so I'd like to learn from you. Are there any barriers to getting everything in? So who's doing the transcription? And I would like to know, in terms of people writing the labels, are they comfortable, or do you ever get pushback on like, oh, actually, I don't want this to go? Because there's always that sort of like, some of the things that we've struggled with is honestly like getting the consent from the label writers to roll that into a public narrative, which is a little wild because it's on the wall. But because we're a university museum, sometimes our label writers aren't actually our staff, they're professors. So I was just curious, like, did you sort of experience any obstacles like that? And if you did, how did you overcome them?
We did not. I'm also at a a much smaller university museum than you. And we have 2 curators and an assistant curator. And they write the labels, or occasionally I write the labels. And if they're suitable to go onto the wall, we consider they're suitable to go onto the website. So usually I transcribe them from whatever the curators give me. And then they just roll over, you know, the day after we input them onto our website, they just roll over to the public website. And we recently updated some of our American labels, and one of them was a portrait of the founder of our city, who within the last maybe 10 years, it was discovered held slaves and had kind of a shady background. So the most recent label about him addresses that and talks about portraiture in the context of who was, you know, who got to be portrayed and who did not get to be portrayed and that sort of thing. So that's on the wall in the gallery, and it's on the website too.
That's awesome. I think we can see our wistful faces.
That sounds great. And I also think it's holding true to that notion that the website is an extension of the museum and vice versa. And that if you're going to put it in the galleries, you should also maybe think about putting it on the website. I think you can tell where my position is.
I agree.
Yeah, and we have somebody who does put them into the database. So it's not a difficult switch for us because the labor is mostly there. It's just getting the sort of consent and buy-in and, like, you know. I think the other thing for us is that we don't recycle labels. We tend to write a new one every time. So it's a little bit more difficult, but you know, I think I like your idea, and that's awesome. We're inspired. And yeah, and from the Mead Art Museum, we have been doing the same, including labels written by our intern students. We keep older labels archived in our database. Awesome. That is awesome. And I do love that sort of touches on some of what Ashley talked about as well as incorporating student knowledge and work. And we do put student labels into the database now too. I think I'm not going to put our registrar on the spot. I know that she's attending. Yay, thank you. So we do. And that's really exciting to see that this is becoming sort of like a widespread practice. Because it definitely wasn't when I started out. Not at the hood, I mean at large.
And I think that's a fantastic way to embody the kind of multi-locality that we say we strive for. There are certainly Dartmouth professors who have students co-author research papers with them. Why aren't we validating their work in the same way by putting their labels on our website, if that's what we choose to do?
This sort of, so this conversation sort of touched on one of our other topics. So I'll read out the topic and then I'll sort of see what, you know, jump there was we sort of talked about models of shared labor and reconciling museums' tendencies to want accurate or near perfect data with allowing lay terms or non-scholarly voices to be brought into the cataloging. And I think a lot of the sort of like just putting if the label goes on the wall, the label goes to the public, and also incorporating student labels and voices as you know, authoritative as well. It's like is a really good sort of answer of that of using your well compensated, hopefully, interns to help with that. You know, this wouldn't be a conference that's also sort of examining technology if we didn't talk a little bit about the information systems that are actually actively getting in the way of this work. I want to make room for this first. Has anyone ever tried interactive, perhaps digital, that would allow visitors to submit their own labels?
I have, but it's been in the context of the labels were part of the artwork, not part of the museum experience. So that's a sort of interesting separation that I'll just throw out there. I don't know on the actual museum side how that would be taken.
Yeah, I was gonna say that I've been a part of a museum that did something like this, but it was like an engagement activity that was posted in a separate area for engagement, where it was write a label, you know, for one of the works that was reproduced there. And then it became part of the records of the museum, but wasn't necessarily attached to the object record, more to like the exhibition programming side of it. So, but the idea of making that into something that would then also live with the object or be part of the exhibition as it is ongoing, I think is really interesting.
And in that respect, I also really like the approach I've seen a number of institutions begin to take of having authored labels named the author to sort of flag that these are written by a single human often, not by just they appeared out of nowhere with a museum authorial voice, and to really shine a light on that these are written from a perspective at a particular time. And that would maybe also even help facilitate bringing more people into label writing or things like that.
Okay, I'm going to jump back into discussion, which is where are the information systems you're working with getting in the way of pushing forward on making metadata more appropriate / inclusive? So, you know, whether you have an enterprise database or your cataloging is in Excel, doesn't matter. You know, what are you using and why is it stopping you